excuse me, if you don't have a lecture packet, they're over there on the counter. I need to make brownies for the printing service. I used to make them all the time when I was working for honors. But I haven't. I ordered these Monday afternoon. And they weren't here yesterday. I was going to run over there after the exam this morning, but they were in our work group. So I was really tight. We have, after today, we have 3 days of lecture left for this unit. So that's why I'm lecturing today. Normally I spend a couple days on the anatomy, a day on the physiology, a day on metabolism, and then the last lecture day is the endocrine control, which is usually a short 40-minute lecture. So with losing a day, I have metabolism and the endocrine control on one day, which is what I have done that a couple of times. But the only problem is we have our digestive exam not the weekend after that, but the very, like 2 days later. So we end lecture on Tuesday, and our digestive lecture and lab exam is that Thursday. Okay, so what I would like to do, today is kind of an underlying information, what digestion is about, the peritoneum and the blood vessels and so on. And we'll start with the mouth on Tuesday. But what I want to do is, and I usually do physiology separately, so I go through the anatomy and then I come back and do the physiology again. So I'm going to try to blend those two together, okay? Kind of like I did anatomy with the urinary system, we went through the whole nephron and we went back again and looked at the function of each structure. So instead of doing that with the digestive system on Tuesday, when we start with the mouth, I'll talk about what takes place, what gets digested in the mouth, what gets digested in the stomach, what the enzymes and the hormones are that control that. So it might mean jumping back and forth in your lecture notes a little bit, but I think it'll be easier to have a lighter day on Tuesday and not wait for a whole ton of metabolism information, citric acid cycle, just a mere 40 hours before your exam. So we'll try to work it that way. All right, so this entire unit is digestive system. There are a lot of the lab port. The reason I have one lab exam for this is because there's a lot of structures, but most of you have heard of the stomach, most of you have heard of the liver, most of you have heard of the pancreas. All right, so it might make it a little easier to remember. And with the histology, we haven't had this much histology since reproductive. So you'll need to start working on that over the weekend. Start looking at your histology atlas and working on the practice. Don't wait for the practice lab until Tuesday, okay? So you get in as much time as possible with those practice quizzes online. The next diagram, this next diagram you have in your lecture notes, and a schematic that takes you through the digestive system. And so we have ingestion, which is where we put the food in, all right? And defecation or excretion, where the part that we can't digest, either because we don't have the enzymes or we didn't have the time to absorb it all, exits the body. And in between we have the actual breakdown of the food material. So when we talk about digestion, the first proximal portion of the digestive tract, we're going to be talking about mechanical digestion. All right? So the mouth and the stomach are involved in mechanical digestion. Small intestine is involved in chemical digestion. Anybody know the difference? What does the mouth do and the stomach do that's mechanical digestion?
Oh, so I'm sorry, you were asking what's the difference between chemical and mechanical?
Yes.
So I'd assume that mechanical is actually breaking them down into smaller pieces, whereas chemical is breaking them down to their chemical components.
There you go. All right, so let's say that I had a big rock, big limestone, and I want to dissolve it in hydrochloric acid. That would be a chemical digestive process. The hydrochloric acid working on the calcium carbonate of the limestone. So I partially fill up my bathtub with hydrochloric acid and dump in this big rock and allow the acid to work on it. And it would eventually fission and break it down into calcium and carbonate ions. But what if I took that rock and pulverized it with a hammer and then took all that powder, it's still a calcium carbonate component, and then added it to the hydrochloric acid. Okay, that's going to work much faster, interacting with the acid in the powdered form, which is still the same limestone molecule. But what's the difference between the two situations? What if I change by pulverizing it? Surface area. All right, so the purpose of chewing food and churning it in the stomach is to break it down into smaller physical pieces so that when it interacts with water and with the enzymes, there's more surface area and substrate available for the actual chemical digestion, the breaking of bonds, carbon and hydrogen, hydrogen and oxygen, and carbon and oxygen, okay? Nitrogen and hydrogen. So that's the purpose of the stomach and mouth, mechanical, though there's a little bit of chemical digestion taking place, and we'll look at that on Tuesday. And then in the intestine, small intestine, we do the chemical digestion where we actually absorb food. All right, so before we look at the organs, like I said, today's kind of laying an underlying basis. For the heart, for the organs of the respiratory tract, we talked about the serous membrane that creates a lubricating surface for those organs. So with the heart, we have the pericardium. With the lung, the pleura. And now that we're in the abdominal cavity, we have the peritoneum. Okay, we talked a little bit about the peritoneum because it formed the outer layer of the uterus and it formed some of the ligaments. So we have heard that term before. So this is just an introduction to the location and structures formed by the peritoneum. So if this is our body cavity without being anatomically correct with the backbone and all of that, all right? We have, let's say that we have the kidneys here, and we have the digestive tube. Maybe that's the stomach, all right? So our membrane, a serous membrane, meaning it has a simple squamous epithelium and loose connective tissue, is going to be attached to the body wall surface. Remember, it goes over the kidneys, does the same thing for the pancreas and for some like the large parts of the large intestine. And it also is attached to the organ wall. So the two components of peritoneum are parietal peritoneum, where it's attached and lining the body wall. Kind of draw a reverse arrow here. And visceral peritoneum. Now when we have the lung, and we put, that's a lung, looks like a pedestal, but it's a lung. And we put our visceral pleura on it. Remember, the visceral pleura reflected back on itself to create parietal pleura? All right, so what happens when our peritoneum reflects back on itself and creates the visceral peritoneum? That there's such a large space around there that we end up, rather than just this fold, we actually have two layers of peritoneum suspending the organs from the body wall or from each other. And anybody remember what we identified two layers of peritoneum? Mesentery, exactly. We had mesosalpinx and mesoovarium and mesometrium when we talked about the reproductive system. So this would be a mesentery. All right? So organs that are behind the peritoneum, like the kidney, are identified as retroperitoneal. They're always along the posterior abdominal wall. We don't have anything retroperitoneal along our anterior abdominal wall as far as organs are concerned. So pancreas ends up being every other part of the large intestine. And as we go through the digestive tract, I'll tell you which ones are intra and which ones are retro. So if it's completely surrounded by a visceral peritoneum, it's identified as within the peritoneum or intraperitoneal. And this would be our peritoneal cavity. Okay. Now I'm not going to ask you to be able to identify the difference, but we have primary and secondary, just as I'm coming to you. We have primary and secondary peritoneal structures, all right? So the kidneys develop from the mesoderm of the posterior abdominal wall. They're primary peritoneal structures. The duodenum, as part of the gut in the embryo, was an intraperitoneal structure. But as the intestines fold, it got pushed against the body wall, and part of that visceral peritoneum disappeared. Okay? So that's what's meant by a secondary peritoneal, retroperitoneal structure. Now I'm not going to ask you, if I say it's retroperitoneal, I'm not going to ask you to learn whether it's primary or secondary, but I wanted to explain what that term means. The pancreas does the same thing. It's fused against the posterior abdominal wall rather than developing from that area. Eddie, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm kind of confused between intraperitoneal and visceral because it seems like it's pointing to...
The organ itself is described. So the kidney is a retroperitoneal organ. The organ, the colon, the whatever would be an intraperitoneal organ because it contains visceral peritoneum all the way around it rather than just on one surface.
Oh, okay, so it's pointing to...
So the membrane is visceral peritoneum, and any organ that is surrounded by visceral peritoneum is an intraperitoneal organ.
Okay, and that whole structure that you drew is...
The abdominal cavity. Okay. So once again, the heart was not in the pericardial cavity. The lungs were not in the pleural cavity. The stomach is not in the peritoneal cavity. The only thing we have in here is serous fluid. The other cavities were more potential spaces. This is really a space. Okay, so it seems most textbooks, many people will talk about it interchangeably. But again, it's still a separate structure as we saw with the other systems. All right, so here's a sagittal section through the abdominal cavity. I'm going to draw the same thing on the board. And it shows structures that are mesenteric structures. All right? So we're going to go through that slowly and identify them, and I'll show it to you via diagrams from Netters as well as components of our model, what those mesenteric structures are. But I just wanted to explain why we use those particular terms. So this is the liver, stomach, transverse colon, so it's cut where it goes across the body. We'll put the pancreas up here. And we've cut through loops of small intestine 2 times. All right, so we'll add the parietal peritoneum. It's the simple squamous epithelium attached to the deep surface of the body wall. Partially covers the bladder. More of the bladder would be covered by peritoneum as it fills and rises up into the abdominal space. Forms the perimetrium of the uterus. And onto the rectum. The pancreas is a retroperitoneal structure. We're sagittal, so we'll have the kidneys there. And then the diaphragm has peritoneum on its inferior surface. Okay. Part of the liver does not have visceral peritoneum, so you label these before I get too far. So again, this is parietal peritoneum. All right, so This space here would be the peritoneal cavity. This is visceral peritoneum. And anywhere it's attached to any of these organs. Right? And then we have visceral peritoneum on our stomach, and it's connected by a double layer of mesentery and suspended from the liver. So that is a mesentery, all right? It's attached to the lesser curvature of the stomach. Remember where the left gastric artery was? And so this is identified as the lesser omentum. So that's a mesenteric structure. At the greater curvature, the mesentery is formed again, and this time it hangs down over the loops of small intestine and comes back on itself as a double fold like that. Okay, folds back. There's actually 4 layers. Now I've drawn a gap there in actuality that fuses, so you can't really put your hand all the way down in there. Okay. This is full of adipose tissue. It's the fatty apron that lies over the intestines, and I'll show you some images in a moment. Notice it doesn't come back to the stomach. All right, it comes back to the colon. So when we lift this fatty apron up, we're not going to see the stomach. We're going to see the colon, because this inferior surface here is going to block our access to the stomach. This has its origin up here from the stomach on the greater curvature. So this is known as the greater omentum, another mesenteric structure. I'll just switch to this. All right, so here would be the greater omentum. Transverse colon cut and cross section. And that forms a visceral peritoneum around the transverse colon. And that is suspended, I'll color here, from the posterior abdominal wall by another mesentery. So here we have mesosalpinx, mesoovarium. So this is known as the mesocolon, mesentery of the colon. And because it's the transverse colon, it's called the transverse mesocolon. Okay? And that would be this structure right here. Now, when I first started talking about mesenteries with the reproductive system, I kind of described on the uterus or on the oviduct, my arm is the organ, and then my sleeve is the visceral peritoneum. This would be the double layer. Okay, this would be the mesentery, suspending my small intestine. So let's say the small intestine is almost 20 feet long. All right. So we'll pretend it's an anaconda. We put it out in a great sheet, and we fold the edges of the sheet together and pick it up. Now we have to attach that 20 feet of mesentery to our abdominal wall. We gather it up into a ruffle about 12 inches. It attaches on the posterior abdominal wall kind of at an angle like this. And that is the root of the mesentery. The mesentery proper would be how that sheet spreads out. Okay, but where it's actually attached and brought together is the root of the mesentery. And that would be the root, and as it spreads out, that's mesentery proper. Okay, now while I leave that on the board, let me show you some images, both from our models and from netters, to illustrate that a little bit better. So here is what mesenteric structure. What would this be? Greater omentum. Okay? Having its origin here is the visceral peritoneum of the stomach on the anterior surface, and the posterior surface would come together and hang down as the greater omentum with all this adipose tissue. And we can see it on this model from our brown torso on this half. So this is supposed to represent the greater omentum. And you can lift it up and look underneath and see all the loops of small intestine. So it's not adherent to it, unless like Cora, you have a lot of abdominal, or cadaver, you have a lot of abdominal surgery and collagen fibers and adhesions form and make it grow onto that. But otherwise, you normally can lift it up and down. Okay? So now when we lift that up, we can see the intestine underneath. And notice that we don't see the stomach because that posterior surface of the greater omentum is adherent to the colon. So when we lift it up, we're seeing this and the visceral peritoneum on the colon, and then this would be the transverse mesocolon. Okay? That is this surface right here when we lift up that greater omentum. Root of the mesenteric. All right, so now the small intestine has been pulled off to the right. Here is the transverse mesocolon again. This is the jejunum, the second part of the small intestine that is intraperitoneal, becoming its visceral peritoneum right here. And this right here is the root of the mesentery, where that sheet of mesentery has been gathered together and attached to the posterior abdominal wall. This could flare out, kind of like, what do they call them in the 50s, poodle skirts. Okay, so this flares out, and this all-pole membrane that would flare out is the mesentery proper. Okay? This is the root. This is where that mesentery proper has been gathered together and becomes posterior parietal peritoneum, where it's attached to the abdominal wall. So here's the transverse colon, transverse mesocolon. Right? Here's the lesser omentum. I don't have any models that show lesser omentum. So on the lab exam, it'll probably be a diagram like this. All right, we do have a tiny little piece on the thin men chart, but it's difficult to find. So here's the lesser curvature of the stomach, the liver, and this is a double layer of peritoneum, simple squamous epithelium with connective tissue in between. At this border right here would be the portal vein and the hepatic artery and the duct carrying bile from the liver. You can actually put 2 fingers behind here and be in this space right here. Because it fuses right here, but it's open here. Not that much room, but you could put your fingers here in that space. Okay? And then again, of course, the greater omentum. The duodenum here is a retroperitoneal structure. All right, so as we go through those different components of the digestive tract Tuesday, I'll remind you which ones are peritoneal and which ones are not. So this is the pancreas. Here's where the transverse mesocolon. Here's where the transverse mesocolon was attached. The first part of the small intestine is retroperitoneal, and then this bend occurs as the jejunum is mobile, and it's intraperitoneal. So it's not adherent to the posterior abdominal wall. Okay, another view of the mesentery proper. This little picture right here. Here would be the root, and then see how this is free and movable. That is mesentery proper, that whole sheet that's extended out there. Okay, any questions on the mesentery? And looking at a variety of views will help explain that.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just not seeing it correctly. Transverse mesocolon is
the transverse mesocolon. Oh, my line didn't go all the way through. I wrote over it. Transverse mesocolon is that.
All right. Yeah.
Okay.
Grouping them.
Yeah, the 2
together
letters,
as a root.
words over root.
Thank you.
Okay, now let's do a little bit of review of the blood supply. We did celiac trunk and its 3 branches. Superior mesenteric artery and inferior mesenteric artery already when we did the cardiovascular system. I'm going to add some additional blood vessels to branches of the celiac trunk, but the rest will be just like we learned. Okay, so nothing new for the superior mesenteric or inferior mesenteric or the portal system. We're going to add about 5 new arteries to branches of the celiac trunk, and those are the major components. I'm trying to see here which would be a better, I'll leave it at that one. You have a diagram similar to this. I drew it from this picture that's on your study guide in the lab packet. And there are questions on the lecture exam that have a similar diagram. And it just says identify A or B or something like that. So I don't have a red pen, we'll just use purple. Pretend this is a fetal aorta. So there's the aorta. And remember the celiac trunk was a short branch. And I'm going to put up here the ones that you learned first already, okay, in the cardiovascular system. So coming off of the celiac trunk, we have the left gastric artery, and it curves along the inside lesser curvature of the stomach. Okay, that would be this one right here. The next branch crossed all the way over to the left, behind the stomach, to the splenic artery. Or rather to the spleen, that it is the splenic artery. And the third one was our common, though I didn't emphasize that part of it, hepatic artery. All right, so those were the 3 branches of the celiac trunk. So here's left gastric, here's splenic, with a little pig's tail there, and here's common hepatic. Okay. So we're going to look at branches for the splenic first, and I'll draw those in blue just to emphasize that they're new ones, even though these are arteries. So coming off of the splenic artery up here near this is called the fundus of the stomach, this top rounded portion. And short branches will supply this fundus of the stomach, and they're identified as short gastric arteries. And that would be these right here. On our large stomach model, here would be the left gastric artery curving along the inside of the stomach. Back here is the splenic artery, and here would be the short gastrics. Okay, just over the surface of the stomach right there. In addition, the splenic artery gives off a very long branch that curves along inside the greater omentum, along the greater curvature of the stomach. All right, so that's going to be this vessel right here. found within the greater omentum. Another name is the gastroepiploic, but since it's found in the omentum, it may be easier to remember it as that. Okay, so those are the two branches of the splenic. Short gastric arteries and the left gastroomental or gastroepiploic artery. The right side is going to come off of the hepatic artery. So we have a branch that comes almost straight down and supplies a bunch of early organs here. It joins with the left gastroomental by forming the right gastroomental, and this is known as the gastroduodenal. And then finally, we complete our blood supply for the lesser curvature by forming the right gastric artery, and it joins with the left gastric. Okay, so those are the new ones. Nothing else is new in the blood supply. So we have the celiac trunk. The left gastric artery joins with the right gastric artery from the hepatic artery, and that is found on the inside, lesser curvature of the stomach. The splenic artery gives off the short gastrics and the left gastroepiploic, and then the hepatic gives off the gastroduodenal, which you can see kind of here in the curvature, and that gives off the right gastroepiploic. Looks a little crowded here, so the next couple of slides kind of remove some of those extra organs so you can see it maybe a little bit more clearly. So again, celiac trunk, left gastric and right gastric forming a loop, left gastroomental and right gastroomental forming a loop, so both curvatures of the stomach, the inside and the outside, are covered. Okay, and then we supply the outer bundus with the short gastrics.
And the hepatic artery proper,
That's after the right gastric comes off. Yeah. I don't really worry about that. Hepatic artery is fine. But that's where we would actually anatomically be starting. The hepatic artery proper is after the right gastric is given off. Okay? All right, so here's the superior mesenteric coming down. And remember, it supplies the small intestine, so this would be the mesentery proper, containing branches of the superior mesenteric. This would be the root of the mesentery right along here. And it gives off branches supplying the ascending colon and transverse colon, which is removed. Okay? So review of what we covered for the superior mesenteric artery. And inferior mesenteric artery, shown here, gives off the left colic to the descending colon and sigmoid colon, superior rectal to the top of the rectum. And internal iliac gives off the middle rectal, and internal pudendal, which forms the inferior rectum. So we covered all of those. You may have forgotten, but it's in your brain somewhere. Another view of that. And then the portal system, no difference. All right, so right and left gastric veins are going to drain into the portal vein, and superior mesenteric vein and splenic vein form the portal vein. So here's your splenic vein and portal vein, superior mesenteric vein forming the portal vein, and inferior mesenteric is going to drain into splenic. Our middle and inferior rectals go into the inferior vena cava, because they're going into the internal iliac vein. Okay, so there's the basic pattern. I have no idea what those blue circles are, but okay. Okay. Now, before we look at the histology, I want to do just a little summary of the nerve innervation. So it's a digestive system activated by the sympathetic or the parasympathetic. What's going to cause the food to move and the enzymes to be digested? Parasympathetic. The rest in the digest. Okay, rest meaning slowing the heart down. Digest meaning, of course, motility. So it increases blood supply. It increases motility, the smooth muscle contraction for peristalsis. And it increases enzyme secretion, okay? So, for parasympathetic support, esophagus, through transverse colon, is done by the vagus nerve. Now, I don't know how much time you guys spent with the vagus nerve, but we can identify it as the vagus nerve down the neck and into the thoracic cavity where it gives off the recurrent laryngeal. When it gets on the esophagus, it forms a rod of branches and plexus. When it gets down into the abdominal cavity, it travels with blood vessels out to the organs along with the sympathetic nervous system. We can no longer identify it very easily as vagus. It's just with a bunch of other nerves, okay? But it's still going to be vagus. Would those be preganglionic or postganglionic fibers traveling to the organs with the blood vessels? Pre. The postganglionic cell bodies are actually found inside the organ itself. All right, so in the wall, between the layers of smooth muscle of the wall of the digestive tract, or inside the liver, or inside the pancreas. So there's very short postganglionic neurons, just micrometers or microns involved. All right. Then, from the descending colon, give myself a little bit of space here. So the anal canal is going to be pelvic splanchnics. Okay? And you're comfortable, I hope, with that term, being parasympathetic. Same pelvic splanchnics we've been talking about that are going to the bladder and the reproductive organs. So all of this is going to activate the digestive system. Now, that's starting with the esophagus. I left off a couple. I knew I was trying to sit there thinking I knew I talked about. In the mouth, we have salivary glands, which are activated by cranial nerves, also under parasympathetic. And so we have the facial nerve, and we have the glossopharyngeal. Okay. Facial is going to submandibular gland and sublingual glands. We'll talk about these on Tuesday. In fact, this morning I told them I would give them the glands on Tuesday. Also, pharyngeal goes to parotid. But just in case you want all of this in the same location. Okay? So when you smell food baking, and you haven't eaten all day, and you come home and you're baking bread or something and your mouth waters, that's going to be primarily the parotid gland under glossopharyngeal influence. right? When you get scared or your mouth goes dry, that sympathetic, not so much inactivating the gland, is constricting the blood vessels so there's no fluid to make saliva. That's primarily why your mouth goes dry. Okay? So, sympathetic is going to decrease or slow down the digestive tract. So if you're taking cholinergic drugs, let's say you're having trouble with your bladder, and you're like our friend on her way to Asia, and they give you a drug that's cholinergic to, actually she was going to the bathroom too often. But let's say you're having trouble going to the bathroom after surgery, and they give you a cholinergic drug. All right, would the side effect be more likely to be diarrhea or constipation? You're taking a cholinergic drug, which means like acetylcholine. Constipation or diarrhea?
Like you said, she wants to.
If it's not her, I changed her. She was having the opposite problem. So you're taking acetylcholine to help you go to the bathroom. Diarrhea, because it's going to increase the rate of motility. All right, for her, she was trying not to go to the bathroom. So her symptoms, side effects, not necessarily having to have them, but if she did have side effects, would be more likely to be slowing down the digestive activity, which would lead to constipation. Okay, so again, we're back to similar to the heart where we have these opposite effects between sympathetic and parasympathetic. So our sympathetic nerves, from the upper portion of the thoracic cavity, we have splanchnic nerves, okay? For the salivary glands, we're not using those yet. These are just going to be nerves coming from the superior and middle cervical ganglia. No names, just sympathetic nerves. Okay, we don't really give them specific names like we use. For the esophagus, transverse colon area, primarily these are sympathetic nerves that are coming from the thoracic chain. They don't synapse there, they pass through and they go into the below the diaphragm, and their ganglia are along the blood vessels. So we have celiac ganglia and superior mesenteric ganglia, where these preganglionic fibers synapse right by the blood vessels, and then the postganglionic fibers travel with the nerve, the blood vessels, along with the vagus nerve. That's why you can't tell the difference. But the nerves that go from the chain to the ganglia are known as splanchnic nerves, and these are going to be the greater, lesser, and least splanchnic nerves. You don't have to know which organ is which, okay? But it's kind of successive. Small intestine, duodenum, liver are going to be greater. Stomach, duodenum, liver are going to be greater. The rest of the small intestine is going to be lesser, and least typically goes to the kidneys and posterior structures. And then the descending colon, anal canal, so the pelvic splanchnics, you already know the answer to this. Just like the reproductive system again, we have sacral splanchnics. Okay. Again, this is just a kind of a pre-outline, and as we go through the digestive tract, I'll reinforce that as we move along. Okay?
So greater, lesser, and least is esophagus down to transverse regarding sympathetic innervation?
Right.
Okay.
Correct. Essentially, if it makes it easier to remember, superior mesenteric artery ended its supply at the transverse colon, and inferior mesenteric artery picked up with the descending colon. That's where we see the switch from vagus to pelvic splanchnics, and from greater, lesser, least to sacral splanchnics. So blood supply and nerve supply change at that same location, from transverse colon to descending colon. Okay, there's a little overlap, but essentially that's the point of change. All right, now I want to lay down a framework for histology, all right, for the tissues that form this tube. It doesn't apply to the salivary glands, it doesn't apply to the liver or the pancreas, but this is a tube that's lined with a membrane. So remember, in Bio 430, you learned about 4 different kinds of membranes. Serous membrane, mucous membranes, cutaneous membranes, and synovial membranes, all right? Our pleura, our peritoneum, those are all serous membranes. Simple squamous epithelium releasing a serous fluid. Skin is cutaneous, and synovial has no epithelium, it just forms the structure of a joint, all right? Mucous membranes by far the most common. So the lining of the trachea and all the airways is a mucous membrane with all the different types of epithelium. The lining of the ureter through the bladder is a mucous membrane, transitional epithelium. Okay? So with our digestive tract, it's lined with an epithelium supported by loose connective tissue, and that's a form of a mucous membrane. We have associated connective tissues and muscle, and so we have 4 layers to the wall of our tube. Some are muscle, some are epithelial, some are connective. And so this is kind of under the headline of general plan. Alimentary is another word for digestive, not elementary, alimentary. Or, bless you, GPAP, okay? So when I ask a question about the GPAP, this is what I'm talking about, how it fits within this plan. Now there are variations. Obviously the stomach is going to have smooth muscle, the mouth is going to have skeletal muscle. The esophagus starts out with skeletal and ends up with smooth. So as we go through the digestive tube, I'm going to relate back to the variations, okay? Here's the epithelium of this organ. Here we add an extra layer of muscle. Here we change the location or something like that, or the function. So we're going to relate it back to this basic structure. So there are 4 components. I have a model of the small intestine, and those 4 components are shown on it. Okay, so we have mucosa. That's equivalent to the epithelium and the papillary layer of loose connective tissue of our skin. And then we have the submucosa, which would be like the dermis, a particular layer of the dermis. We have a muscularis externa, which is the muscle that moves the food. And then we have our visceral peritoneum, or the serosum. So those are the 4 basic layers that I'm just going to outline on the board. So the lining of our tract is the mucosa. Epithelium. And we only have 2 different epithelia throughout the entire digestive tract. The beginning and the end. The mouth, esophagus, anal canal are all going to be non-cornified, non-stratified, squamous epithelium. Not non-stratified, non-keratinized. So non-cornified or non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, resisting abrasion. From either dry fecal matter or corn chips that you didn't chew up. Okay? Every epithelium has an underlying loose irregular connective tissue.